Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's Midday Science Cafe. We are so excited to have you. We have Matthew Dods and Hanna Breunig for curbing climate change through carbon removal, just in time for Earth Day. So we can't wait to hear from both of them. We're going to start out how we always do, with a land acknowledgement. So we recognize both UC Berkeley and Berkeley Lab recognize that Berkeley sits on the Huchun territory, the ancestral and unceded land of the Ohlone people, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. Every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. By offering this land acknowledgement, the Berkeley community not only recognizes the history of the land on which we stand, but also recognizes that the Ohlone people are alive and flourishing members of the Berkeley and broader Bay Area communities today. Thank you so much for allowing me to make that land acknowledgement. Before we get started with our amazing program, I just wanted to let you know that there are two ways to engage with us and our speakers. One is through a Q&A function that you can find in Zoom, and the other is through the chat function. You can add your questions. We encourage you to do so. That's what the Science at Cal events and Berkeley Lab events are all about, is engaging with our scientists. So please ask a ton of questions, and you can add them either to the chat or the Q&A box. You don't have to add them to both. We'll see them and we'll ask our scientists the questions that you share with us. The other thing I wanted to mention is that this is being recorded. So if you'd like a copy of this or find it on YouTube, you will be able to. We'll send you a recording at the end of our program. The last thing I wanted to mention is that there is an option to see closed captioning within your Zoom function box. Either it's going to show up automatically at the top or at the bottom, or within your 3-dot-more function. You can find those closed captions there. And I haven't mentioned this yet, but my name is Dion Rossiter, and I am the executive director of a program called Science at Cal at UC Berkeley. And in 2008, Science at Cal was envisioned as a unifying effort to raise public awareness, understanding, and appreciation of scientific research at Berkeley. To realize this vision, we engaged the vast Berkeley science, technology, engineering, and mathematics community, that's STEM, to foster creative collaboration amongst campus and community-based groups who share our commitment to equity and inclusion in STEM education and STEM careers. All of our events, as you can see here, are free. All of our events are geared towards public audiences. And we really connect researchers with a diverse community of groups of all ages and backgrounds for engagement, for learning. Accessibility, inclusiveness, creativity, and innovation are all hallmarks of Science at Cal events, which reach tens of thousands of people annually. Science at Cal presents ongoing, like I said, free outreach programs on and off campus, helps promote related efforts on and off campus, and creates new programs and initiatives between Berkeley and our community. This broad scope of activities is made possible by Science at Cal's dynamic network of campus alliances and valuable community partners. So we hope you'll join us for more events and more programs throughout the year, and I hope you will join us again for another Midday Science Cafe if this is your first. I'm going to hand things over to Jen Tang, who's going to talk a little bit more about Berkeley Lab and our partnership.
Thanks so much, Dee. So as Dee said, I'm Jen Tang, and I'm the Director of Community Relations at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And for those who aren't familiar, Berkeley Lab is one of 17 U.S. Department of Energy national science laboratories across the country. And we are supported by the Department of Energy's Office of Science and managed by the University of California. All of the research we conduct at the lab is unclassified. Now, since our founding in 1931 by a UC Berkeley physics professor named Ernest Orlando Lawrence, we've been dedicated to advancing the scope of human knowledge and seeking answers to some of the greatest problems facing humankind. Today, Berkeley Lab employees work together to develop meaningful scientific solutions to the world's most intractable energy and environmental challenges. We help train the next generation of scientists and engineers, and we ensure that those things happen in a manner that benefits everyone. Our main campus is located in the hills of Berkeley, and our close ties to the UC system create a really unique and synergistic environment for scientific discovery. A number of the lab's researchers are affiliated with one of the UC campuses, either as students, postdocs, or professors who might have a joint appointment at the lab to do research. And we're especially fortunate to have a close relationship with UC Berkeley. Our institutions have joined forces to advance science across many frontiers. And one of the main motivations for creating our Midday Science Cafe series is to share with you examples of compelling and complementary scientific research from both of our institutions. And we hope you enjoyed today's presentation on carbon removal. So Dee, I'm going to hand things back to you to introduce our first speaker.
Yes, of course. Thanks, Jen. So I am going to introduce Matthew Dods so he can go ahead and join us and pull up his slides. Matthew is a Ph.D. student in the Department of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering at UC Berkeley. Originally from Southern California, Matt completed his BS in chemical engineering at USC. His undergraduate research was primarily concerned with environmental reaction engineering and catalyzed his growing passion for material science. An avid interdisciplinarian, Matt enjoys working towards the resolution of environmental challenges. As climate change is so multifaceted, he believes that the best way to mitigate sustainability is by carefully considering diverse viewpoints. Working in the lab of Professor Jeffrey Long at UC Berkeley, Matt's scientific contributions bridge the atomic and industrial scale in attempting to uncover efficient ways of capturing carbon dioxide and other environmentally relevant gases. His research seeks to tailor the properties of gas separation materials to their desired industrial application, which we will hear lots about today. When not in the lab, Matt loves playing basketball, video games, and spending time in nature. Matt, we are so excited to have you. We cannot wait to hear from you. So go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thank you, Dee. It's my pleasure to be here today talking with you about our first of the two carbon removal strategies. Today, I'm going to be talking about something called direct air capture. And to accomplish this, I'm going to be introducing a class of materials known as metal organic frameworks. So let's dive into it with some motivation. Why do we care about doing direct air capture? Well, I think as many of us already know, atmospheric CO2 compositions have been steadily rising over the past few decades. As you can see in this figure, on the y-axis, they're plotting CO2 composition in units of ppm, that is parts per million. So for example, if we had 400 ppm, that would correspond to 400 molecules of carbon dioxide for every million molecules of air. And on the x-axis, then they're plotting the year over the past 10 years, with a little bit of extra. When looking at this figure, the first thing that stands out to me is the amount of fluctuation that's going on with respect to time. You can see there's this kind of oscillatory or wave-like dependence of the composition on time. But also, as you can see from the different colors, upon geographic location, as shown in the top left, they are plotting 4 different locations around the world. As a consequence of these elevated CO2 concentrations, there's a lot of undesirable effects, and these are just a few of them that I've listed on this slide here. We have rising sea levels, acidification of the world's oceans, an uptick in the prevalence of intense natural disasters, and an exacerbation of habitat losses. So there's a lot of interest in reducing atmospheric CO2 concentrations, and it's becoming increasingly likely that we'll need to rely upon something called carbon dioxide removal, which describes the set of techniques that are capable of capturing and storing CO2 that is already found in the air. And you can see from this figure that carbon dioxide removal can be either natural, for example, forestry initiatives, or it can be technological, for example, direct air capture. So what is direct air capture then? It describes the capture of carbon dioxide from air using machines. If you take that carbon dioxide and you shoot it deep underground, you can prevent it from re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, and you will have accomplished carbon dioxide removal. So I'm going to cut to the chase and say that direct air capture is very difficult, no matter how you frame it. And the reason for that is quite simple. It's because carbon dioxide is present in such a low concentration in air. Air, as you can see from this pie graph, consists of mostly nitrogen and oxygen, and only 0.04% carbon dioxide. So we can rewrite that as a fraction, 400 divided by 1,000,000. And that's where that ppm business comes from, 400 ppm. So I'm going to motivate how we're able to capture carbon dioxide from air. And to do this, I'm going to start by constructing an analogy to describe the importance of something called surface area. To do this, let us imagine that we have a bus. And instead of emitting carbon dioxide, this bus captures it. So we have CO2 that wants to enter the bus, but the CO2 can only be captured if it has a seat to sit on. So the bus has to have a seat where it can capture the CO2. You've got your CO2, you've got your seat, and the seat captures the CO2. If it doesn't have a seat, it can't capture CO2. So we'll start with the first of 3 case studies. Let's start with case 1, where you have the CO2 try and enter the bus, but there's no seats. The bus cannot capture any CO2. What if we add 10 seats? Then we can capture 10 molecules of CO2. What if we add 50? You can then capture 50 molecules of CO2. So I'm sure you can extend this off into infinite directions, adding thousands and thousands of seats. You can capture more and more CO2 in that same bus. So that's great, but let's try to extend that to materials now that can actually capture CO2. Let's use the same principle we just learned. When looking at these 2 materials, I'm going to have material A and material B. Let's focus first on material A. This has 15 of those seats around the circumference of this circle. And it has a surface area. So that is the area of the entire surface respective to its mass. So we have meters squared relative to 1 gram of this material. How about we look at material B now, which has this kind of all these cracks and crevices inside of it where you can accommodate more and more seats. And so material B can capture more CO2 in the same amount of material. The material B can capture more CO2 because it is porous. And I'll return to that principle later. Which leads me into the next part of today's talk in motivating this thing called metal organic frameworks. So what is a metal organic framework? Let's break it up into bits. We'll start with the first word, metal. I'm sure that all of us have encountered metals in our daily lives, whether it's in the aluminum foil used to make your dinner or in the quarters used to pay for your laundry. You can see there are many, many different metals on the periodic table, and you can actually make MOFs out of many, many different types of metals. But that doesn't mean that you should, because some metals are so rare, they're so hard to find in the earth that it's not economical to produce MOFs out of them. Because of this, I like to focus on earth-abundant metals like magnesium. Magnesium comes in many different forms. You can see here's magnesium metal. It looks like a metal. And there's another one that I like to use called magnesium nitrate. Now, magnesium nitrate, the magnesium is a little bit different because it has a positive charge. Magnesium metal, it has no positive charge. You need that positive charge to be able to make a MOF. And so I like to use magnesium nitrate for that reason. So what about the next part of our definition here, organic? I'm sure that all of us have seen the organic aisle at the grocery store, but in chemistry, it means something a little bit different. In chemistry, it refers to a class of molecules that have carbon atoms, hydrogen atoms, and often also oxygen and nitrogen atoms. So we have carbon with C, hydrogen and H, and these are bound together by either a single bond or a double bond. And so the organic molecule binds together metal atoms in the MOF. This is an example of one of these organic molecules that I use to make MOFs regularly. You can see you can either write it with the structure on the left, or it's much easier to write it with the one on the right. So you'll often see people use this notation. And this molecule has kind of a long name, 4,4 prime dihydroxy something something. We call it H4-DOBPDC for short. So what about the framework? Okay, so this is a little bit more difficult to understand. But let's picture a building that is being constructed, for example, the one on the left, where it has this repeating unit. This kind of this like box-looking thing that extends off in this direction and this direction. It's kind of like a tessellation with a repeating pattern. So that framework is where the metals and the ligands come together to form a MOF. So let's look at an example of a MOF that I often use for carbon dioxide capture. It's called magnesium 2-DOB-PDC. So the little 2 there, that means that we have 2 magnesium atoms for every DOB-PDC organic molecule. It's a ratio of 2 to 1. So how do we make this? Well, we can take that magnesium nitrate I showed earlier, and we can react that with H4-DOB-PDC, the organic molecule. It's kind of like a white powder. And you can make magnesium DOB-PDC, which is also a white powder. But you can see from this structure, it's a little bit hard to see from this particular angle, but you can see that the green spheres correspond to magnesium. Everything else corresponds to GOBPDC. But I think what is most interesting about this structure is what's going on in the middle. There's nothing. It's a void. Magnesium DOBPDC is porous because of this. Going back to that circle analogy I had earlier, where I had the one with all the cracks and crevices. It has a lot of cracks and crevices in this sense. But just how porous is it? Now, this is where it gets really exciting. Imagine that you have the surface area of an American football field that is compressed into a single gram of MOF. This is about 1 gram of MOF. I've got my penny here for scale. That's crazy. You can capture a lot of CO2 with this MOF. So how do you actually capture CO2 with the MOF? Well, in industry, we can conceive of this configuration where you have the MOF that is packed into a pipe. Just as a simplification, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So the MOF is the orange circles, and we're flowing air across it. And over time, carbon dioxide, it sticks to the MOF. And over time, it keeps sticking to the MOF. And eventually, the MOF can't capture any more CO2. So you want to try and recover the CO2 to be able to use the MOF again. So to do that, you got to supply energy in some form. You can supply heat, you can supply steam, vacuum, or something else to release and collect that captured CO2, leaving you with the MOF that you started with. And you can do that process again and again and again to be able to capture more and more CO2. So this requires some energy. There's no two ways about it. How much energy does it require? To do that, let's construct another analogy. Here, I'd like for us to imagine an apple that is sitting on the Earth's surface. Okay. Now, suppose I want to lift this apple up by 1 meter or 3.28 feet. The energy that you need to supply to do that is about 1 joule. This is a unit of energy that we use in science to describe that amount of energy. So imagine now that instead of 1 apple, we have 1 billion apples. So to lift those billion apples by 1 meter, we supply 1 billion joules. That's a lot of energy. I don't think I could lift 1 billion apples by 1 meter myself. Maybe on a good day. So a modern direct air capture plant, to put this into perspective, requires about 7 billion joules. For every ton of CO2 captured, that's very important. Why? Because we need to capture many tons of carbon dioxide per year. Just how many tons do we need to capture? Well, it's hard to say, but we're going to need to capture at least 1 billion. It's becoming increasingly likely that we'll have to be capturing many more than that. As you can see from this figure, it's a little bit hard to decipher this, so I'm going to walk us through it. They're plotting global total net carbon dioxide emissions in units of billions of tons per year. With respect to time, and regardless of these two colors that are being plotted, you can see that this number becomes negative over time. And that means that we have to capture carbon dioxide from air using one of the strategies I talked about earlier. The gray and the blue correspond to whether you've overshot the 1.5 Celsius warming target, that is, whether you've exceeded 1.5 Celsius warming relative to pre-industrial values. So let's take those two values and let's try to get an idea of the total amount of energy that you would need to supply to be able to capture that 1 billion tons of CO2 per year. So to do that, you can multiply these two values together that we've got at the top. And you can see from the units that this will cancel. I can draw my cancel here. I think I can do that. Ton cancels with ton, and you're left with joules per year. It's 7 billion joules per year. That's a lot of energy. That's a lot of apples. But to put this into some more understandable terms, let's think about world energy consumption. Currently, we consume about 580 billion joules of energy as a society. So if we divide 7 billion by 580 billion, we get that the amount of energy needed for direct air capture would be about 1% of all of the energy consumed by humanity. That's crazy. And that's probably even a conservative estimate, because when you look at this figure, remember I said that we're capturing at least 1 billion tons of CO2 per year. In some cases, it could be many more than that. As such, there's the number of companies that are commercializing direct air capture with the goal of trying to reduce the cost of doing that, the energy expense as well. Currently, it is being performed on the thousands of tons per year scale. This is a plant in Iceland with plans to expand capacity to the millions of tons per year scale by the year 2030. This is a plant that will be constructed in Wyoming in the United States. And so this leads into the research we're doing at Berkeley. Well, we're doing a lot of things, but I'm going to try and summarize them in just 3 quick images. We're trying to increase the CO2 capacity, so we're adding more seats to the bus. We are trying to reduce the energy required, that is, to minimize the number of apples that have to be carried, and ultimately to reduce the cost of performing direct air capture. And so at that, I thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have any. And this picture, in case you don't have any questions, is this is an instrument that we use to study CO2 capture in our lab, where you place the MOF, in this case, into a glass tube, and you submerge that into a bath of constant temperature, and you study CO2 capture that way.
Very cool. Thank you, Matt, so much. We do have some questions coming in. Why don't we ask one before we hand things over to Jen and Hanna? Is it actually difficult to make the MOFs?
No, not at all. Actually, it's relatively easy. I'll go back to that slide just for our visual.
Yeah, sure. Please do.
Yeah, so you take the magnesium nitrate and you take the H4-DOB-PDC and you dissolve them in a liquid solvent. And then you heat that solution. You wait a few hours and you've got your MOF in that liquid suspension. Then you filter off the liquid from the solid and you get this white powder. So it's actually quite easy to make.
Oh, very cool. All right, well, let's hand things to Jen. Thank you again so much. We are, like I said, we have some questions rolling in. So everyone keep asking those questions and we'll have a big, long, wonderful Q&A session after we hear from Hanna. So thank you again, Matt.
Fantastic. And yeah, thanks, Matt, for that presentation. It was great. It is actually my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Hanna Breunig. Hanna is a research scientist and the deputy head of the Sustainable Energy and Environmental Systems Department in the lab's Energy Analysis and Environmental Impacts Division. She specializes in the techno-economic analysis, market analysis, and environmental and human health impact assessment, which is also known as life cycle assessment of emerging energy and negative emissions technologies. She has a BS in environmental engineering from Cornell University and a master's degree and Ph.D. in civil and environmental engineering from UC Berkeley, so go Bears. In her spare time, Hanna enjoys rollerblading, curling, and spending time outdoors with her family. Hanna, over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for letting me come and speak here. And it's really fun to come after Matt's talk because I'm a super fan of MOFs for a long time. So today I'll be introducing another type of carbon removal technology called enhanced weathering. So let's dive into the details of weathering. So erosion and weathering go hand in hand. So it's something that you're familiar with. In fact, signs of erosion are one of those many fun things to point out when you're taking hikes or walks, especially with kids, because it changes the landscape around you over thousands and thousands of years, but in ways that are very impressive and affect the way we've designed our civilizations. Weathering, though, is actually the process of breaking up rocks, while erosion is, in fact, the movement of that rock material that was made movable by weathering. And the processes of weathering and erosion can be seen everywhere in California, from south of the Bay Area and Joshua Tree to north of the Bay Area and the Trinity Alps. It's one of the many reasons people come here is for the signs of erosion and weathering. They're so beautiful. And weathering can happen in many different ways. First, it can happen mechanically. This is one we really can understand. You have rocks that have cracks and crevices in them. Water seeps into that, and as the temperature cools, they freeze. And when water freezes, it expands. It applies pressure on that rock material, which ends up breaking up that rock material into smaller pieces that can be moved through erosion. There's also a lot of gases and minerals that are exposed to each other, and this can lead to chemical reactions. One that we're very familiar with is when iron is exposed to oxygen, it rusts. That's something we see all around us, and this happens in nature too. And finally, weathering can happen through biological processes, whether you have the little roots of plants finding those cracks and applying force and breaking them up, to reactions that occur because of the organic matter exposing the surface of different minerals and rocks. So how is this related to climate and carbon removal? Well, the Earth's crust, over 90% of it is made up of silicate materials. And these materials are actually very reactive with carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is exposed to these minerals through the production of carbonic acid. So you can think of this as when moisture or rain and air come in contact with each other. The CO2 and water form carbonic acid. And that acid can, in effect, attack minerals in silicate minerals in rocks, dissolves them, and forms what we call bicarbonate ions. So there's a lot of different silicate materials out there, and they have different reactive potentials. Now, over the course of time, this bicarbonate eventually finds its way to the ocean, where it can actually act to buffer or counter acidification of the ocean. So the ocean really responds to the concentration of carbon dioxide in the air. As Matt showed, that concentration is increasing over time despite the fluctuations from year to year. And over very long time periods, tens of thousands of years, the ocean is one of the Earth's many mechanisms that can actually stabilize and control and what we call buffer that change. And so that's one process where enhanced the weathering can lead to control of carbon dioxide. Another method is actually the fact that that bicarbonate becomes accessible to organisms that turn it into solids such as shells. And that can store the carbon dioxide over long periods of time as well. So this process occurs over geological timescales, and believe it or not, it's thought to play one of the most key roles in stabilizing our Earth's climate. So enhanced weathering is really just us trying to speed that up. We don't have eons. We want to work on these problems and see the effect of our solutions in a matter of decades. And so we want to learn new methods for speeding it up. And terrestrial enhanced weathering is what I'm going to be talking about today. And that's the process of basically identifying the most reactive materials, making sure that they're the size that will be most reactive, very similar to what Matt was talking about, is increasing surface area to increase the reactive potential of these minerals, and then applying them in areas ideally that are warm and humid, where the reaction rates are going to be happening much faster. There's a number of different pilot projects happening around the world, so it's a very exciting time to be in the enhanced weathering field. We're seeing projects happening in Brazil, the United Kingdom, and throughout the United States. We even have one very close nearby the Bay in Davis, in California. And this is led by the Working Lands Innovation Center. And the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, including my group, is partnering with them to take that data and understand what's actually happening when we're doing this enhanced process. There's many different rocks that have been exposed to the atmosphere. So you might think, well, if 90% of the crust is made up of silicate materials, this is going to be easy peasy. But the reality is those materials have been exposed to air and water and carbonic acid for a long time. They've lost a lot of their reactive potential. So we need to increase the reactive potential. We also still don't quite know all we can about the types of minerals that are most reactive. So there are many different types of silicate materials, and this is just showing a couple. On the right-hand side, you have a basalt rock, and on the left side hand, you have a beautiful mineral called olivine. Now, these two I'm featuring because the chemistry of what their composition is potentially can trap a lot of CO2, more than other minerals. So it's very exciting to identify regions that have an abundance of these very close to the surface, so we don't have to make gigantic mines to pull this to the surface. So weathering and erosion, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, can really expose new rock surfaces. So can human activities. The history of mining and quarrying has pulled up lots and lots of these materials. And in the process of recovering ores that are precious from these mines, a lot of these rocks have been ground up. So there is already a plethora of locations with these minerals that could be tapped into. And there's even some evidence that these materials are already helping to accelerate the reactive process. But we need to identify, as I mentioned, the rocks that are going to be most reactive and have a process for increasing the reactive rates, and that's decreasing their size. So why is that a bit of a challenge? Well, as I'll discuss here, smaller particles take more energy to make. So when we talk about particle diameter, you've got the circle and its diameter. 1,000 millimeters is just a bit longer than a yardstick. So these are kind of the boulders of a quarry that we're starting with. Not as much surface area as we want, and so the reactive potential is just not going to be there. Now we have technologies that can crush up those boulders and start to get to smaller sizes. And on the right-hand side, I show you between 2 and 10 millimeters is kind of the size of beads that you might be familiar with. Okay, great. Well, those technologies use diesel, which is a fossil fuel, and there are emissions associated with that. So we have to think about the amount of energy we're putting into getting the size particle we want. Now, if we start going smaller than that, it gets tricky, and we need different technologies than just crushing technologies. We need ones that can grind, and these tend to use a lot of electricity. And that electricity, while it might not seem clean, you turn a switch on and there's a no emission that happens the way a lawnmower or a diesel generator, you can smell the emissions, but they happen somewhere. So when you generate electricity off of the grid, there are power plants that are using coal and natural gas, depending on where you're living. And we have to be responsible for the emissions associated with our process. So I'm going to show here in a plot the effect of your source of electricity on those emissions. So on this y-axis, it shows the CO2 emissions that result from processing a ton of rock into the diameters that's shown on the x-axis. So we're starting here, it's diesel emissions, but it's not requiring as much as what happens when you start to go to these smaller sizes. And so you see, if you're using wind electricity, you can get to very small particles without a big penalty, a lot of emissions. If you're using the California grid, we're pretty clean grid, but we still have emissions. And believe it or not, that can add up. And the average US grid is even higher. And that's just the average. So we have to think very strategically about our source of energy. And this also gives us a rule of thumb for the reactive potential of the minerals we're interested in. So you can see if we really rely on the California grid and we need to get down to a small particle size, we need rocks that are going to have capture potentials of over 200 kilograms of carbon dioxide per ton of rock. So some exciting news is we went out into the field, a quarry in upstate New York. That's where I'm from. Hi, Dad. He's watching today. From Northern California. And we found a lot of different types of mineral samples that are silicate materials. And we looked at what the composition of them is. So we did an analysis on their composition. And based on just the chemistry of what's in those materials, we figured out the amount of carbon dioxide that could theoretically be captured. And we discovered there are some really impressive candidates out there that are capturing far above that 200 kilograms per ton of rock target that we're really worried about making sure we hit, assuming we don't have wind available for this type of application. So again, very rich in olivine, which was that mineral that I showed that was quite green and beautiful. And so we targeted that mineral and was saying, okay, so that's one of our best case scenarios. Let's assume we can acquire that mineral, grind it up to the size that we need. And now let's start to prove this in the field. So that's where it gets really exciting. We are starting to do some pretty interesting experiments in these soil test beds up the hill at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. So we've taken a set of mineral samples, as I showed. We're applying them to the soils. And we now are using techniques, both experimental and computer-based, that allow us to understand over 100 years, something that we could never do a lab experiment on, what is going to happen in the soils where we're treating these materials. And we are finding that there are all kinds of benefits that are happening beyond just the reduction of carbon dioxide. over a period of 10 or 20 years. So that was step one, making sure the reactions can happen at a speed that is relevant to the climate change problem. Step two is now looking a little bit more and making sure that they're healthy soils, that the soils are going to benefit from this treatment. And we've seen over the course of human civilizations, silicate materials have been used in agriculture for a long period of time. And now we understand much more about what's happening. Many of these materials have nutrients that are very important for crops. They also can contribute that bicarbonate, which reverses acidification of soils, which is really problematic, especially in many areas of the United States. There's potential to have such a healthy soil that it actually improves the retention of water, decreasing the amount of water you need for irrigation. And there are some natural emissions that come from soils of N2O, which is a greenhouse gas emission. And we're finding there can be reductions of that emission based on this application. So we're doing the experiments to actually measure and quantify these benefits that happen beyond just carbon removal. So this was taken a few weeks ago after all this rain. So I just want to note how green it is compared to a year ago when I took this photo of the team that I work with. So this is the team learning how we're getting some of those gas samples from the pore space. It's really fun to see them work. And my job in this is I'm not an experimentalist, but what I do is I look at the potential approaches for this and understand the cost and give them a sense of how much does it cost if it was scaled up to a farm or 100 farms or 1,000,000 farms, and what the cost would be per ton of carbon dioxide avoided. So the Department of Energy, or DOE, has what's called an Earthshot, an ambitious target for carbon removal technologies like the one you've heard me and Matt talk about. And they have a $100 target for 1 ton of CO2 removal. And the fun news is we're starting to find with our initial results that we're getting very close to that target. So there's a lot of exciting promise in this that deserves us exploring this much further. And so just in closing, I'll summarize by saying weathering is a natural process. Terrestrial enhanced weathering speeds up the process by grinding up reactive rocks, spreading them on soils. Humans have benefited from this process for centuries, but we're still learning how to scale it up in a way that helps us with our climate change problem. And recent research is allowing us to really better understand the processes and lower costs. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Hanna. That was a fantastic presentation. Questions are coming in, so I'm going to ask you one or two, and then we'll bring Matt and Dee back to join us for a broader Q&A. So can you talk a little bit about what components or properties of rocks dictate their reactive potential?
Yeah, absolutely. So silicate rocks are, and particularly what we call mafic and ultramafic types of silicate rocks, are rich in magnesium and iron and silicon, and they react with that carbonic acid to trap the CO2 into a bicarbonate form. So you get those mineral ions, and then you get another ion, which is actually bicarbonate. And that is where you can start to create a capture system for carbon dioxide.
Got it. Thanks so much. And speaking of bicarbonate, are there any side effects by creating more bicarbonate ions that make our ocean more acidic?
So bicarbonate ions do not make the ocean more acidic. Adding carbon dioxide into the ocean is what makes it more acidic. So you can think your ocean is in equilibrium with your atmosphere. If we pollute and emit more CO2, the ocean has to equilibrate with that higher concentration of CO2. And like I said on that slide, water and CO2 react to make carbonic acid. That drops down the pH of the ocean, and that is a process that happens extremely fast. Now the ocean then has bicarbonate and carbonate in it, which can actually suck up that carbon, that acid basically, and buffer and stop the acidification. So adding more bicarbonate improves the ocean's ability to basically soak up that acid.
Fascinating. Well, thanks for those answers, Hanna. I'm going to have you stop share your screen, and then I'm going to invite Dee and Matt back to join us for our Q&A session.
Hi,
Hello,
everybody.
hello.
All right, so Matt, we'll just hand things over to you. There are a bunch of questions that have come in, and these are really good questions. Like, our audience is very in tune. You did it. And by the way, you got a lot of thanks, Matt. That was amazing. Great presentation, really clear. So our audience really appreciates you. So question that a few people ask is, what makes the MOF actually select the CO2 over any other gases like oxygen, nitrogen, etc.? So why CO2 specifically?
So CO2 is what we call a Lewis acid. It's something that accepts electrons. So you can leverage Lewis acidity by having things that give electrons. And so oftentimes we'll take them off and we'll add other molecules to it so they can interact selectively with the CO2. The MOF that I showed is not quite the thing that we use to capture the CO2. We add a molecule called an amine, amine. It's another type of organic molecule that can give the electrons to the CO2 and capture that, but not the other stuff that is found in air.
Very cool. That answers that question, folks. Few of you asked it. Another one that a few people asked, how do you actually, do you do something with a MOF with the CO2 on it? Do you pull the CO2 off of the MOF and then store it somewhere? And then you can use the MOF again, like have it be infinitely recyclable. And yeah, so that's sort of the question about what do you do with a MOF with the CO2? Is the CO2 pulled off? If it is, what do you do with the CO2? If it's not, what do you do with the whole thing? Is it toxic?
Yeah, so the
whole
MOF,
mess of questions.
yeah. These are all great questions.
Yeah.
So after you capture the CO2, you want to try and release the CO2 and reuse the MOF over and over again, because if you have to keep replacing the MOF, that gets to be kind of expensive. MOFs they're not dirt cheap. They cost something to make. And so the cyclability of the MOF is very important because of this. How stable is it basically? If you keep doing that process over and over again, do you get the same performance over and over again? And that's a critical part of what we're doing here at Berkeley, is trying to improve that stability.
So once you pull the CO2 off, what do you do with the CO2?
Yeah, so then you can utilize it, so you can convert it into some useful chemical, or you can sequester it. So you can compress it typically to pressures of around 150 bar, and you shoot that deep underground.
Okay, and is MOF toxic at all?
The toxicity of this MOF has not been thoroughly investigated, but I will say that magnesium itself is not really that toxic. It's a relatively inert metal. The ligand itself could be toxic. That still has to be demonstrated. But I work with it regularly. I'm still alive, so.
Okay. If that's sufficient enough for our audience, we'll know. They'll let us know. All right. Jen, do you have any questions?
We do. They're coming in hot and fast, which we appreciate. So, Hanna, a couple questions for you. Can you talk about how many acres of land would be required to spread enough minerals to remove 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide a year?
So I don't have the number off the top of my head for 1 billion, but we have been looking at the surface area in California required to basically hit some targets that the governor's office has put out for carbon removal. And we have found that we have more than enough combined marginal lands, we call them, that are not yet farmed, rangelands that are acidified, and croplands that we have to use to lower in the millions of tons of CO2. So it's not a small amount of land, but it's also a substantial amount of carbon. And so this is something that we're interested in, is that we need to make sure that we have the appropriate surface area. And that is also going to depend on the amount of rock that we're applying on one. Do we apply a lot all at once, or do we apply just a little every few years? These are the kind of questions that we need to figure out. And that's one of the things we're doing, is trying to create a best practices approach for farmers so that they understand what they're getting into.
Got it. That makes sense. Sort of related, can you talk about what types of soil might emit more carbon or less carbon?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. We've seen the Dust Bowl is a great example. we've seen when you lose your topsoil, a very rich layer of soil that is rich in organic carbon, you have a lot of problems. Not only are you not growing your crops, but you're going to be not having such stability in the root structure. And you're going to be losing that precious topsoil, which is rich in carbon and nutrients. And so there's a major effort in retention of carbon in the soils. And some of that can come from the way we are farming, the way we're kind of irritating the soil. So carbon emissions can happen from soils that there's change on them. We're interacting with them more, we're churning them up, and we're having releases of CO2. However, naturally, there are different soils that are emitting more or less N2O. And one thing that's really interesting is grasslands actually emit a substantial amount of N2O. And this is something that we're looking at is, are there ways to treat that where you might not necessarily get a benefit of growth from the crop, but maybe you're getting an increase in grass that you then have your cows or other rangeland animals eat instead of eating corn feed or something else. So there's a lot of these layered on benefits. And so location's really strategic here.
Oh, it's fascinating. So I've got a question for both of you, maybe. What can be done with all of the carbon dioxide after it's captured? Are there any uses for it?
I mean, I could take that one, and Matt, feel free to add on after that. So I'll just say one of the beautiful things about the approach that Matt's doing is that it gives a lot of confidence that the money we're investing in capture is actually capturing CO2, unlike very biological and natural processes like enhanced weathering, where we like to see our results, right? And with enhanced weathering, you don't really see it. And so we are focusing all our attention on scaling up confidence and measurements. But when you have a chunk, a gas bottle of CO2, great. But now what do you do with it? Well, you can turn it into all kinds of products, particularly because it's carbon and oxygen. And what are we using petroleum products for? Well, they're rich in carbon. So CO2 is a carbon feedstock that we can use to replace petroleum to make plastics, to make ethylene, to make methanol. Basically, the building blocks of our society are using carbon. Even cement processes consume CO2. So there's a lot of products that we've built our economy around that can use CO2.
That's fantastic. Matt, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, building off of that. So we're interested in trying to create kind of a circular carbon economy. So you're trying to move away from fossil fuels. You can take the CO2 and convert it into fuels that can be used for that purpose, or a bunch of other things.
Great. I'll go ahead and ask you a few more questions about MOFs. So, well, actually, somebody asked a question that was sort of built off of your last answer. They said, am I right that capturing CO2 can also be used in cement manufacturing, which sequesters CO2 in cement products?
Yeah, that's a really critical target that people are interested in.
Oh, perfect. So yes to whoever asked that question. All right. And then there was a group of questions all around essentially the energy required. So could you elaborate on the strategies to reduce the energy required? And then also, is the energy that's required to create the MOF included in those calculations for how much carbon is being captured? Like, are you, subtracting that when you create those calculations?
So, okay, so I'll start by the question regarding how to reduce the energy required. So the thing is that carbon dioxide is so dilute that you have to have something that binds it strongly. It's really critical to make sure that you're not binding it so strongly that you can't then release it. So you want something that kind of finds that happy medium where you can capture a lot of it, but still recover a lot of it. And as for the other question regarding the energy expense of the process, that 7 billion value does not include the amount of energy needed to make the sorbent. So that has to be included in a careful life cycle analysis. And those materials are likely not MOFs. Just to provide additional clarity, there are a bunch of other porous materials that are being investigated for direct air capture, like silicas. So that's a silicon and some oxygens that are bound into a porous configuration.
So somebody asked about that's a great question, or great responses. So thank you for that. Where's the plant in Iceland?
It's so I'll try to pronounce this. I think it's Helisheli. I don't know how to pronounce this language, but I'll spell it. Okay, HELLISHEDI.
All right.
Yeah. Sorry, my pronunciation is probably not good.
No, no worries. Maybe the person who asked that question is familiar with Iceland, so they know exactly where that place is.
And
What
I'll
about
just add on to that,
Mhm.
where they're injecting is a basalt formation. So there's a lot of links here. So they're identifying places where you can inject underground where they know it's going to be trapped rapidly and permanent. So if they're injecting into something that has a lot of basalt in it, they're doing in situ enhanced weathering, basically. So that's a nice coupling of the two technologies.
Oh, nice input. Thanks, Hanna. I love that. Yes, it's like bringing these two technologies together. So for MOFs, as it relates to commercialization, are there companies out there working on this? Are there companies out there working on CO2 capture with the technology of either using MOFs or other kind of materials to capture the CO2? How far are we away from scaling? What do you think is how viable is this in the near or long-term future?
So for MOFs in particular, the one that I talked about today, magnesium DOB-PDC, is actually being commercialized by a company that we work with. There's a lot of interest in that MOF because it can capture so much CO2. It's hard to say what exactly the status of that is right now. It's probably going to be bound by intellectual property things, but hopefully it's going to be available soon for us to use at the large scale.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. So a couple more questions about soil, Hanna. Hanna. So first, would carbon capture in treated soils increase the fertility of the soil? And therefore, could this be used to help regions with soil that can't support agriculture or reclaim contaminated lands?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're bringing in bicarbonate into the soil, and that is buffering any acidification that can happen, but also the material comes with nutrients that are key for those soils. So you potentially could create a boost in the fertility of those soils without adding synthetic fertilizers. The one thing, however, to be careful about is when I started introducing that, I said really finding the climates that are warm and humid are key targets because they really speed up this process. Well, that's an overlap with areas that tend to be very vulnerable. They're developing countries, and we need to make sure that the practices that we're using in those areas are being done in a way that doesn't lead to unintended consequences. We also need to do it in a way that really empowers local communities and keeps them engaged so they understand why they're doing something, what they're being told, and that can really help them improve their soil quantity, the soil quality without buying fertilizers.
Got it. That's great. And that's really important. Thank you. Sort of bringing it back home a little closer to California. So one of our audience members understands that a number of California crops like acidic soils. So if you're looking at acidic soils, would that be an impediment to broad use of mineralization?
There's a sweet spot. So when we talk about reversing acidification, we're talking about soils that have a pH lower than 6.5. And there's a sweet spot in what crops grow on acidic, super acidic soils versus moderately acidic soils. So the amount of material that is being consumed in California to counter acidification will tell you that farmers are waging a war with acidification in California. It's also true that there are soils that are very alkaline. So it's the reverse. So acidification you can treat, as we're talking about here. When you have a soil that's very alkaline, what I understand from farmers is they're going to be passing on that problem to their grandchildren and their great grandchildren. That is a very difficult problem to solve. And so you can treat acidic soils as much as you want with these materials, but to go to a alkaline soil, you need to make sure that you are not going anywhere near there with this type of rock material. There needs to be other solutions for that. So that's very tricky and something we need to be mindful of.
Got it. Thanks, Hanna. pivoting a little bit, can you speak more to limiting unintended consequences when applying large-scale terrestrial enhanced weathering? Is there still some uncertainty to the broader ecosystem impacts of enhanced weathering?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the deployment of any any big amount of new, there are unintended consequences we need to have measures in place to take responsibility for. I firmly don't believe you can make any substantial change in infrastructure without causing problems somewhere else. That's part of my job, is identifying what that problem is and trying to figure out solutions. So enhanced weathering is really in the early stages. We're just starting to see 1 acre being treated and starting to understand what the consequences might be. So we are, again, working with local partners to make sure we're getting their feedback on what's concerning or problematic for them, whether it would have a change in the water consumption, whether it could introduce something like nickel, which can happen in some of these materials. These are all the kind of consequences that we're looking at, starting in our test beds and pilot projects. So there are a lot of uncertainties, which is really why we need to scale up research in this area and start doing demonstrations to see.
Got it. Thanks, Hanna. Matt, I'm going to ask a question for you. What are the strategies to reduce energy required to desorb carbon dioxide from MOFs?
So ultimately, you want to try and tune the energy that is required to capture the CO2. So we want something that has just the right amount of binding energy. That is the strength of the bond between the thing that's capturing the CO2 and the CO2. That tells us the minimum amount of energy that's needed to split apart that bond.
Got it. Thanks, Matt. And let me ask this question. It might be for both of you, might be for one of you. Is it possible to use coal mining or other mining waste to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? Maybe perhaps as an element of mine land reclamation?
So that one's going to be for me. So yeah, the mines are, when you are making a mine and basically getting an ore out of materials, you create the waste rock, the rock that doesn't have your ore, and that's what we call mine tailings. So those can often sit in piles, or they can actually sit in these like slurry ponds. And absolutely, this has been a critical thing that we're looking at, is what is the composition of those mine tailings? How long have they been exposed? Is it just that top layer that's been exposed and the bottom layers are rich for the taking for this application? So there are a couple projects around the world that are looking at mine tailings, particularly for products that we know create a lot of these mafic and ultramafic rocks, which is nickel. So that's a key one. Asbestos, that's another key one that creates a lot of this. Diamonds, that's another one. And there's a handful of other ones. But as I mentioned, asbestos and nickel aren't exactly the safest materials to have contaminating our soils. So this is why we're taking a very cautious approach to using those first. And we're starting to look at just quarries as our source of material.
Thanks, Hanna. That was great. Matt, do you need to put the MOFs in a high density CO2 location like an exhaust, or are they effective if you just put them anywhere where CO2 exists, anywhere and everywhere to collect CO2? Is that important, the CO2 concentration?
So it becomes a lot easier. It's still not easy to capture CO2 from something with a higher concentration. So a lot of people are interested in placing the MOFs directly at the exhaust of a power plant or some other industrial facility. So that wouldn't be classified as carbon dioxide removal, but rather something called carbon capture. I guess we often use that term, but there's a lot of interface between the two. So as part of our attainment of stringent climate mitigation goals, we have to figure out ways of decarbonizing various different industries, the power generation sector, and carbon capture and storage could be one way that we could do that.
Very cool. Are you familiar with the Martian Perseverance experiment MOXIE for producing renewable fuels?
I don't think I am.
Oh, okay. Because somebody asked a question about basically how much more energy would be required to not just capture the CO2 using the MOFs, but then also use it in this electrochemical reaction. But that's fine if we'll move on to another question.
Yes, it's an interesting, yeah.
Yeah. Again, sort of these combos of these different technologies. Hanna, did you want to say something?
Yeah, absolutely. So taking the CO2 from a direct air capture system, such as what Matt's proposed, and then the attachment actually can, if it's electrochemical process, it takes electricity to take that CO2 and turn it into a product. And one of the real challenges is we're finding the energy associated with that can be equivalent or higher than what it took to capture the CO2. So right now that coupling is very tricky, and there are many projects going on right now to understand how do we tackle that problem, and also how do we develop a system that is the same size as the direct air capture. So a lot of times the electrochemical process is mimicking production of chemicals at a big chemical plant. It's huge, huge. The benefit of being big is you have cheaper costs overall because you're doing things in bulk. So being able to now do that at the smaller scale is something that electrochemical approaches could do, but they consume a lot of energy. So that is an area ripe for research, absolutely.
Very cool. Thank you. Yep, I love this because we have to always be weighing the benefits and the cost as it relates to energy, and then hopefully the technology catches up to itself so that we're not using so much energy when using these technologies. That's great. So, Matt, did you see there's a follow-up question about maybe using indoor air as for sort of a mini MOF situation? Is that anything you're aware of?
Yeah, there's a lot of interest in that, capturing CO2 from buildings where it's slightly higher concentration than atmosphere.
Right, right. So yes, is there a way to do that? Yes, it seems like that's something folks are working on. So thanks
Yeah.
for that question. And then we're going to ask you both a question we like to ask all of our speakers because we have all different kinds of people in the audience, including students and teachers and folks who maybe have relatives or friends or family in college maybe, and just curious about your career trajectory or your education trajectory. How did you get into this space? It's so specific, but yeah, I'm guessing you both came from different kind of pathways to get here. So could each of you describe sort of how you chose this field, what motivated you, what were some of kind of the highlights of your education?
Yeah, I can go first. I've always been interested in the environment. As a kid, I was really interested in gardening. But as a very young kid, I remember I have one memory in particular. I was like maybe 6 or 7. I was sitting on a beach in Malibu next to my sister, and she told me that each grain of sand on that beach contained trillions and trillions of atoms. At the time, I didn't know what an atom was, but that was the moment when I became interested in chemistry.
Oh, thank you, sister. If she's out there, watch this. So then did you become a chemistry major? How did it go from there?
I became a chemical engineering major. I had another experience in 5th grade when I watched a documentary on how orange juice is made. And that, to me, the process of making orange juice and then many other things, I watched a lot of documentaries on like how things are manufactured. That's what got me interested in chemical engineering proper. But now I guess it's like full circle. I work in mostly a chemistry lab doing mostly chemistry.
So you're merging the creating and the environmentalism together in this way.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. What about you, Hanna?
Yeah, I started in material science actually. I was always really into solving problems and had an aptitude for math and science. Didn't fully know what I wanted to do when I went to college, to be honest. Went in, and one of my introductory courses was on reclaiming a island off the coast of Massachusetts that had been severely damaged by human activity. And that just lit my fire, and I changed majors that semester into environmental engineering. I then went on because I was really passionate about solving tricky problems and becoming a scientist. So I did some lab coursework, and I worked in a lab developing biofuels from switchgrass. That was my first introduction to renewables, clean energy, that kind of thing. But I quickly realized that I was really curious about the blocks of a technology becoming successful. So kind of a higher systems level problem solving than about actually working on the technology itself. So I decided my poor pipette thumb would get a rest, and I switched majors, and now I just have carpal tunnel from texting and typing. But no, I really feel I'm so lucky because I found my happy place, and I get to work with people who are doing the experiments, and I love understanding what they're doing. But then I also get to work with policymakers, startup companies, academics. So I'm really in this happy kind of translating the science into action spot.
That's awesome, both. Thank you so much. I am a social sciences major, but if I had heard you two, maybe I would have changed my career trajectory into a STEM field. I have one more question for you, Hanna, because I think it's coming up more in the news. And so one of your areas of expertise is conducting techno-economic analyses to evaluate the viability of emerging technologies, of which there are many. Can you talk just really quickly about why TEA is an important tool?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have scientists developing cool new technologies, identifying cool new solutions at the lab scale, but they're building off of the knowledge of other science done at the lab. And so they've seen progress such as improved energy or improved reactivity and all of these things that tell them they're probably going in the right direction. But then when you look at the wrapper of real life around that technology, that's going to be limiting its performance. So you have engineering systems, you have human interactions, you have operating time of year, seasons. All these things can affect the true performance of that technology. And why I love working at Berkeley is because no one wants to work on a technology that isn't going to make an impact. That's boring. It's a waste of our time. So they want people like me who can help them translate that initial potential that's super exciting. And that's what's going to get them into the big journals. But to get them into a market, into a startup company or something that is very profitable and effective, they need to work with me to understand, all right, tell us the bad news, tell us the things we need, tell us what we need to work with, and then we will design our technology to hit those targets rather than the targets we think we're hitting.
Got it. Thanks, Hanna. And Matt, I saw you nodding your head along. Do you want to add anything to that?
Oh no, I think it's very important. Yeah, like I think like as a chemical engineer, like I'm always interested in finding the things that are going to be practically viable. It's like as I was talking about earlier with MOFs, with rare earth elements, it's like that might not be economically viable. So I focus on things that are lower risk in that respect.
Got it. Thanks, Matt. Well, I noticed we're already getting close to 1:15, and I want to read one comment that we got in the chat before we wrap up. And this comes from one of our attendees who just wants to thank both brilliant speakers. They said that you have excellent science communication, which is really critical. And I just want to say thank you to you both for excellent presentations. So before we close, thank you so much for your presentations. Thanks to our audience for showing up and for asking really fantastic questions. Just a quick reminder for those who have come to multiple Midday Science Cafe lectures. As you know, we usually take a break in May, but we will be back in June for a summer slate of really interesting topics for you. In the interim, as always, if you'd like to stay up to date on research coming out of either UC Berkeley or Berkeley Lab, you can visit science@cal.berkeley.edu or lbl.gov. And thank you so much. We will see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to our amazing audience as usual.